HDHomerun's Curious Tech. Today we're covering my home lab. We're going to step through every piece of equipment, why we have it, what it's for, what's cool about it, and in the theme of Curious Tech, what does it enable you to do? What can you experiment with by having it, or what little projects does it enable you to do? How nice is it to have home infrastructure? To start a new project and be able to start using the infrastructure you already have in order to enable your projects to go a little bit easier. For example, I run a NAS and I edit all my videos right off the NAS so that I can go from between computers and all of the files are still there. How nice is it already to have a NAS with enough space that's performant enough that I can actually use it in that manner? In this video, we're going to step through all of the equipment in the lab one by one, talk about why we have it, what's cool about it, and at the end I'm actually going to have a couple nuggets to talk about if I was building it today, what would I pick? Not because of the things I have are bad today, but just because technologies move forward. Things didn't exist when I put this equipment together. In addition to that, what you see now is all of the core networking gear that's in my utility closet. It's not the best place, sitting next to that giant water heater, but all of my Cat 5e for this house was run to the garage. The house was built that way. So I had it all run back to the most convenient place, which happens to be a utility closet. In addition to the firewall, the NAS, and the switch that's sitting here in the core environment, I also have an UPS in order to be able to keep these things running through short power outages and be able to handle some graceful shutdowns if need be. In addition to the core equipment, I have a number of other things here. So what you see is the 3 servers I have running. Yes, they're laptops, but they're servers. I was able to get these on surplus, so I have 3 of these. In addition to that, I have a NAS, homemade NAS that I built. So that's a network attached storage. So that's what's actually storing all of my file shares and computer backups. In addition to that, I have a few WAPs, wireless access points. And I have one here just so you can see scale next to a fire alarm. So you can see the one that I have is very small, but I have 2 of those in the house, one on the 3rd floor, one on the 1st floor, just to get me good coverage. So this is a close-up of the firewall. This is the hardware video, so I'm not going to dig in too much to all the software that's running here, but the key thing to know is that this is a small, low-power, fanless server designed and dedicated to running firewalls. So it's got multiple ports on the back, all of it's gigabit Ethernet. The way that this embedded computer is designed is all of those gigabit Ethernet ports use PCI Express directly to the chip, so they're fast. The specific platform that I got is from Protectli. So here you see I'm going through the website. It has a lot of really cool features. You can do things like LTE failover. Yeah, you can fail over from your main internet provider to a wireless provider. They actually help with a plan for that as well, where they help you purchase that plan. They put one together specifically for this. In addition to that, you can make it a wireless access point, so you can have this running your Wi-Fi as well. So this little box is pretty powerful. It can do a number of things, but in particular, it's the main firewall. That's what I use it for. One of the things that the Protectli goes and does is they know people are using these for firewall, so they test them for a number of firewall scenarios. So what you see me walking through here is an open VPN test scenario. So what they're doing is they set up a test environment, a couple test servers, a couple test firewalls, and they run VPN traffic through it. This website talks about their configuration and how that looks. I have the Firewall 4A, and as you can see that has gigabit normal network connectivity, and in addition IPsec, which is a different test that's almost identical to the one that you saw here. The IPsec configuration is doing over 500 megabits per second, and the OpenVPN over 100 megabits per second. And that changes based on the size of the platform that you buy from Protectli. What's that do? That helps you know how performant your device is. There's a lot of firewalls or wireless routers, all-in-one routers that you can buy, and they're not very performant. You're seeing a lot of gigabit Ethernet coming home. If you want to do anything but just have that gigabit Ethernet come into your house, most devices are going to struggle to keep up with gigabit Ethernet performance. Actually, you see a lot of the major providers releasing newer routers that they'll sell to you or rent to you because they need to be able to keep up with gigabit speeds. If you're on this channel for home lab, you're probably looking at doing things slightly beyond the capabilities of a normal home router. And so having your own dedicated custom built firewall it gives you the capability to do that. But what's the issue? If it's too wimpy, if it's not performant enough, it just won't be able to keep up with those workloads that you're interested in. And as soon as you try to turn on a couple cool features, whether it's intrusion protection system, whether it's a lot of firewall stateful rules, all of these things that you could do, services that you could run off of your firewall, it's performance tanks. And that's your main firewall and router, right? That's the main place where all of your traffic comes in and out. So if it's not performing well, internet for your entire house, that leaves your house, I should say, is being bottlenecked by the lack of performance. So you want something decent at that point. So that's why I chose this platform, as at the time, for something that was custom, something that I could manage, something that had a lot of features and was still performant. I just didn't see a lot of options. And I've been running my own firewall for this reason for many years. So it was nice to go from a much bigger, bulky server down to a nice fanless embedded machine that's very low power. The next thing is the main switch that I'm using. So I went with Ubiquiti's EdgeSwitch. This is their kind of professional sort of line, the Edge line versus the UniFi line. I went with this for performance reason. My thoughts were around going best of breed technologies for every component of the system. At the time, the EdgeSwitch was much more performant than their UniFi switch. They actually posted packet per second specs. Packet per seconds talk about how many packets can be moved through the system throughout all of the interfaces. So, a general rule of thumb is a gigabit interface in one direction with the maximum number of packets is 1.4 million. 1.4 million packets per second fully loaded. But more reasonably, you could think of, somewhere in the range of 100 to 200,000 packets per second on a normal interface. And so if you start mapping that out, you could say, hey, 16 ports, 100 megabits, how many gigabits per second is that? And that's sort of a reasonable place. But if you're doing different projects, you have traffic and with what they might call east-west traffic, so traffic that may not be going out to your internet, but just staying within your network. If you have a lot of that kind of traffic, that might eat up a lot of that bandwidth. In addition to, you've got potential people going in and out to the regular internet. So if that's the case, you need a switch that's capable of handling that. So I didn't want to go with a switch that wasn't as performant. And so the EdgeSwitch here ends up being a really good bang for the buck for all the features you get, in addition to the performance you get. So that's how I ended up with that one. The MyCloudMirror NAS is a device I actually gave to a family member. They didn't use it for a few years, and I found it just collecting dust. So I said, hey, if you're not using that, I know it was a gift, but I'll put it to use. And they didn't want it, so I ended up taking it back. But essentially, I use that to record all my videos. I'm using UniFi's camera setup, and they all record bound down to this NAS. So it's a nice dedicated recording device. It handles 4 cameras recording to it, no problem. So the other device here is a Raspberry Pi, another very low power, lightweight server that I have running. And that's one to just run a couple of services within the core, what I call my core environment. So some services that I want to be on the uninterruptible power supply, so I don't want the power to go out on it, and that stuff is just running. The key with the Raspberry Pi is it's essentially a full Linux distribution. There's some nuances that separate it out, but for the size, for the power, it's a great choice to run a couple of small things on. What's nice, and I haven't done this yet, is I do have a PoE switch, so I can kind of clean up some wires if I switch over to what they call one of these PoE hats, so it doesn't have to get separate power from another location. So yet another thing to optimize when I get around to it. So I went with the light access points from UniFi. Even at the time of purchasing them, they weren't the most performant ones, but when I saw what was coming out from UniFi, they had their Nano HDs, which use the exact same footprint, but they were starting to come out with Wi-Fi 6 devices. And the Nano HDs were noticeably more expensive than the lights. And so I said, well, let's just start and see what it's like to use the lights. If I have 2 of them, then that'll give me plenty of coverage for the house. I can use the extra software to help with network efficiency to make up for not having quite as peak fast of a Wi-Fi device. And it actually works really well. So I just decided to start with that $79 device and figured if I liked it, if I used it, then I could upgrade to the Nano HD, or if a future one came out, I could upgrade to the latest and greatest. So I could just sort of buy the cheapest one available, put the network together, see how it's going, and if needed, upgrade from there. The homemade network attached storage is one of those things where I had pieces laying around. I kept thinking, man, it'd be nice if I had some centralized storage for a couple of different things. Things like backup, time machine backup for the Macs, Windows backups, just a number of things to just store stuff on. I said, you know what, why don't I just put something together and go from there. So I was previously using this as a home theater computer. It was also doubling as my old firewall. I had some old drives laying around from when I was thinking about doing a NAS before. So I had almost everything. I think the only thing I had to upgrade on this platform, one of which I'll talk about in a minute, which is the hot storage or the fast NVMe based storage. And the other one is expanding the RAM. So this had 16 gig or 8 gigs of RAM. I expanded it to 16 gigs. When I was thinking about fast storage for the NVMe, I was like, man, this is an old platform. How am I going to do a hot storage? I could use a SSD, not the as performant, right? You're not going to get nearly, you're going to get maybe a fourth of the speed you could get if you were using flash through an NVMe. So I did some research and found out, you know, I expected these devices to exist as a daughter card or a PCI Express card that could plug into the device, hold your NVMe card, and then allow that to just work. So I bought one of them, worked right out of the box amazingly. Put your NVMe drive in there, plug it into your host system, and you're off to the races. I ended up doing a little bit of research. Not the most optimum device. There's some more expensive NVMe drives that are recommended. You know, I went for sort of a mid-grade, you know, a drive that's consumer oriented with leaning towards some professional features around things like capacitors on there in order to be able to drain state and actually have a better idea of writes that are intended to go to the NVMe to go to it. In addition to that, I also have an uninterruptible power supply, also known as a UPS. So the design here, or the concept here, is if power spikes come through, it's a surge protector. If the power goes out temporarily, if you have some sort of blip, you have to do the math based on how much power you're drawing or how much current you're drawing, and then how big the batteries are on the device and tell you how long it'll last. So you should be able to get one, depending on your core equipment, you know, at least 10 minutes, probably as long as 45 minutes for your very core equipment. You know, a firewall shouldn't be pulling too much power, and everything else that you have running there shouldn't be your heavyweight pieces of equipment. So you should be able to get a good amount of time if you've got big enough batteries on your hubs. At this point, I've covered all the main components. I've covered the main switch. I've covered the fact that I've got a cluster of computers running. Those are the 3 laptops for all dedicated extra computing, the built custom home NAS. You've got the firewall, that platform that was higher performance that you can get typically from consumer grade equipment. As you can see, I picked every piece of component either because I had it already laying around and it was useful, or if I was going to buy it, I went with one of the best bang for my buck that I could get for that segment. The best firewall I could get for that segment. The best switch that I could get for that segment. Right? Some of the best access points that I could get in those segments. I didn't go for the exact absolute best access points in that case, but I went with very high performant access points, very stable access points, with the idea that that footprint could upgrade me to an even higher performance upgrade or even higher performance access point. Where's the bonus content? You mentioned there's going to be some bonus content. So let's step into that. So what we're looking at here is a sample network architecture diagram from UniFi, a really simple one. And my home network's essentially set up exactly like this. I've got some cameras, I've got some access points, I've got a main firewall, and I've got a main PoE switch. You've got some devices that listen to those off of wireless, and you got some that access over hard Ethernet. So my network looks almost identical to this at this point. But what are some of the things that I would do if I was buying this equipment today? So take a look at this. These didn't exist when I first bought the access points that I bought. They had the Nano HDs, and I think they wanted almost $180 per Nano HD compared to the $79 for the lights that I got. Well, look, they came out with Wi-Fi 6 versions of the lights. Same footprint, same size. So the 2 access points I have can now upgrade to these. Really cool devices, support the latest specification with a pretty noticeable performance increase while continuing to work with all the gear that I already have. So I'm definitely going to upgrade to at least one of these. When I look at the performance metrics on my dashboards, I notice that one of my access points gets linked to far more than the other. So that one's definitely going to get upgraded, potentially both of them, but absolutely that first one. In addition to that, there's another device called the Dream Machine. The Dream Machine Pro is a pretty cool device, also didn't exist. This replaces almost everything in my core environment. The software that I'm running on my Pi 4 would run on this. The NAS for the video recording, that would run on this. The Firewall, that would be this machine. So multiple pieces that you saw in my utility closet would all condense down to this single appliance. And it all would support the unified centralized interface, which is nice for just not having to tweak one of many other things you have to tweak in a home lab. That's the only downside of the home lab, is everything takes tweaking and you're never done. So getting something that's easy like the UniFi environment, which today I can't be full UniFi because I have different pieces of equipment at different phases. So that means I have to manually sync and organize a lot of those pieces. So another piece of device that came out is they upgraded the UniFi switch to version 2. Now when I look at the specification on version 2, it now has the identical performance specifications as the EdgeSwitch. So that makes me believe that they're probably taking those chips that are inside of that one appliance, putting them in this new one and running it with the UniFi firmware, the UniFi software for this switch, potentially putting it in a different enclosure, different package, and now supporting the UniFi integration. So if that existed when I purchased, I absolutely would have gone with the UniFi kit because I was already going to have to use UniFi software to run my access points. So being able to have the integrated environment all the way through would be really nice. Speaking of performance, I threw this chart in here because I really wanted to talk to you guys about comparing performance specification from devices like these. So one thing you want to take a look at here is they talk about IPsec. Now you'll notice when I went over the Protectli, I went over IPsec performance numbers. You have to be very careful in this space. How these devices are tested significantly impact the performance data that you're going to get out of it. So if they're not under the same test, then you can't really compare those numbers too much. But what you can compare is the overall order of magnitude or the gross size of the numbers. If one size of the number is significantly larger than the other, then you can get at least a good feel for that one is significantly outperforming the other. So when you look at UniFi's product suite here, if you look at the bottom, that gateway device, their original gateway, is physically the same size as my Firewall from Protectli. They serve the exact same purpose. However, if you look at the IPsec performance, it's quoting 40 megabits per second, where if you look at what Protectli was quoting was over 500. So you're talking well over 10 times the performance. Even if those numbers aren't exactly comparable because of the testing configurations, 500, noticeably bigger than 40. No matter what, if you normalize the testing scenarios, 500, the system that was running at 500 is still going to be faster. Same thing when you look at their Gateway Pros, Protectli still outperforms that. And that's what I was comparing to at the time that I built my Firewall for Protectli was, hey, these were the bottom 2 devices. I think I can do better than that by putting my own firewall together. I'd rather spend the money on something that's going to be able to get peak performance than just the ease of use. If you go up one machine higher than that, then you'll notice the Dream Machine, the first version. And now all of a sudden the Dream Machine starts to become in the same ballpark. Once you go to the Dream Machine Pro, which integrates the camera device, integrates the firewall, all of these integrated devices in addition to the UniFi controller, that starts to look very compelling, especially at the retail price of $379. I think last Black Friday I seen them selling them at $300 a piece. That is outrageously compelling, especially when you look at the IPsec performance on the Dream Machine Pro. So all of a sudden, the performance is now becoming best of breed. The price isn't egregious. I mean, if I was building this today, I'd go with the UniFi Switch, PoE, and I'd go with the Dream Machine Pro, and I'd completely condense the complexity that's in the network. It's not that complex, but just the extra devices that are in the home network. It's hard to make that call when I already have everything and it's stable, it just runs. But if I was making that purchase today, I definitely would consolidate that down. A few times I have cameras, so it's just worth mentioning the kind that I have. I went with a couple of these G3 cameras. I initially made a mistake thinking because they were UniFi branded that they would be integrated with the same UniFi controller that the company uses, Ubiquiti uses, but they're not. They're different UniFi platforms. So I could have easily went with a different camera vendor. I went sort of with the quick naive assumption that the controllers were identical for them so I could centralize the management of the networking and the cameras. But either way, I went with the UniFi setup. They work pretty well. They're fairly stable. I went with a couple of G3s, and I also have a Pro as well. I throw this UPS in here because it is the same specs from the same vendor as the one that I have, except for the one that I have is designed to go into a rack, and this one sits on the floor. If you notice where my UPS is sitting, it's on the floor, and this one is like 40% cheaper, and it has more plugs. You can pretty much guess which one I would buy. I initially was planning to buy a maybe 12U wall rack mount that I plugged everything into, which is why I ended up with the rack mountable UPS. As you can see, I did not end up going that route. I went with something a little more rudimentary, but works just fine. So that's how I ended up here, but clearly I'd go with just the floor UPS. If you're doing something rack mountable, obviously it's nice to have the rack mounted UPS. Next device isn't so much part of the homelab per se, but it's a network device, so I figured I'd include it. Kind of like the cameras, they're not really part of the network, but they're a cool networking device. This thing's called the HDHomerun. So one of the things that has happened for many years is the FCC had some rulings around cable companies being forced to provide cable cards if you ask for one. So what you can do with this device is if you get a cable card from your cable company, if you have cable, you can plug it into this device, and this device puts 3 tuners on your home network. So devices can subscribe to these tuners. So your TV can connect to it, your iPad can connect to it, your phone can connect to it, up to 3 devices at one time. And they can just start streaming live TV from your cable package by connecting to this device on your home network. I've had this thing for years. It's been sort of the crux of my home theater setup. And once I was able to start moving to native apps on the different devices and not have to run a dedicated home theater PC, this thing just kind of sits in the network room and devices just are able to pull from it. The company that makes it, they don't make this version anymore. They've been working on a 6-tuner version of this for some years. I guess it's stuck in development hell. But either way, this is an interesting part of the home network that I thought I'd share. HDHomerun Prime. So I walked through some of the core pieces of the network. I went through some quick hits. I didn't dig too deep into network performance testing. I'm thinking about doing a detailed deep dive on things like packets per second. If you guys are interested in that, please let me know in the comments. Otherwise, this is the home network. This is the foundation. Once you have all these pieces, you have lots of building blocks. You know, when I talk about a NAS that can run VMs and Docker containers on it, when you start talking about multiple, when you start talking about a cluster of computers, you can start doing things like Docker, Kubernetes, just having compute available. That gives you a lot of freedom to be able to build things out, test things that you wouldn't normally be able to do. When you have a high performance network gear, you can actually start making use of that stuff. So this is my home lab. I'm not feeling too pressured to upgrade at the moment, but it's worth just knowing about how to be able to select those devices, how to get a few grades ahead of consumer grade devices, and get the best bang for your buck. That's really what I was going after. And as you're making some of these choices, you can make choices based on ease of maintenance, or you can make choices on some of the best performance per dollar. I just covered hardware because there's plenty of plenty of stuff for us to cover for the hardware perspective.
I got a whole nother video coming on what is all the software that's running on all of these things. You know, I gave a couple of hints just now on some of the software that's running on here, but this was really meant to be what is the hardware that I have in the lab. Thanks for tuning in to the channel. Please like it. If you made it to this point and you must have enjoyed something that I shared today, hit that like button. If you want to see more of the content that I'm putting out, subscribe. Until the next time, Curious Tech out.